the whole winter, and then come to this lectureship time, and about Sunday I really started getting it. So if you'll bear with me, hopefully I won't break down. Eddie Parrish is here, and I know he can finish the thing up in case I don't make it. I'd like to correct two things before I begin. I don't have a lot of time to really do that, but if you are using the book or have seen the book, there's some biographical information. I don't know quite where they got it. The brethren in Marietta, Oklahoma will be rather surprised that I'm their preacher, since I've never even spoken there. But I am, as was mentioned, the director of Turley Children's Home, and we'll begin this next month preaching on Sundays on a pretty regular basis for the church in Glenpool, which is a Tulsa suburb, but not Marietta. The other thing, somehow in my manuscript, and if you have the book, I would ask that you correct that. I managed to get Mary, Martha, and Joseph. I have no idea about that. I do know Lazarus was the brother. But you know these things, I'm boys. We live in a very exciting time. You stop and think about all of the changes all over the globe. The explosion of knowledge and technology, political changes. 1991 was an amazing year, and it shows every sign in 1992 of perhaps being just as amazing. But you know, in this age that most of us would not trade for another age because it's so exciting, we've taken quite a toll as far as the advancements that we've made, and at the same time the stresses and pressures we all feel. I know some of you will have problems seeing the transparencies, but hopefully it'll be of some benefit to you. I think there are three basic sources for the stress we have. Number one is just simply the fear and the threat of violence and theft. At one time it was safe to be in rural areas or in small towns or in certain communities, even within a metropolitan area. No place is really safe anymore. Second thing is that there are an awful lot of lonely people. We'll talk about what's happened to the family in a few minutes, and we'll see that much of the loneliness and separation has come from the lifestyle that we've adopted over the last few years. Number three, of course, add to that, and this is especially in our part of the country, the oil patch, very real to us, professional insecurity as a result of technology, where many people who once trained for jobs and they thought they had a job for the rest of their lives in that particular profession no longer have it. But you know, among all of the things that I think about that affect us as a result of this, I can think of nothing that is sadder than what has happened to families. I look around me and I see so many families and so many marriages hurting. Divorce is at an all-time high. We have so many who are now trying to get along raising a family as a single parent. And when you really look at the communities around us, almost every community, a significant number of people are in that category of either being single parents or it being a second or third or more marriage. The secular community is recognizing that what is happening is not good. Some of the polls have been taken more recent months, in fact the last 2 or 3 years, indicate the American people as a whole are concerned about the family. There have been a lot of articles written in newspapers and magazines and so forth in regards to it. But just to give you quickly a little bit of information that I think is significant from the standpoint of the secular society, in the little paper called The Child Advocate, put out in Oklahoma City by the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy. The front page article says, "Kids in the Middle, Helping Families Cope with Divorce." And they mentioned that in the United States more than half of all marriages end in divorce. And experts say that more than 1 in 3 minor children will experience at least one divorce situation. Here's the shocking part of it, and they give these statistics. What happens to children of divorce? As I mentioned, 1 out of 3 children as they grow up will face at least one divorce in their family. 75% of all children receiving treatment are children of divorce. That's for chemical dependency. 63% of all teens committing suicide are from the families where there's been a divorce. 75% of all unwed mothers, and 50% of all children on probation. Then it goes ahead to say that children of divorce tend to have more academic, discipline, and health problems. they're 5 times more likely to be suspended from school and 2 times more likely to repeat a grade or drop out. You know, that just simply says to me, and I think it's apparent to all of you, we better be serious about what's happening to the family. And I'd like to believe, but I really can't, that these are problems out in the general world and not problems we face in the church. But I know better. I've been in child care too long to really believe that that's the case. In our Brotherhood Children's homes, more and more of our children being placed in the homes come from homes of members of the church. And I don't really see any sign of a real turnaround in these areas. Again, if time permitted, I could do a little more on this, but look what's happening in America in just one day. It's shocking. Look at it while I keep talking because I don't have time to really comment on it. But I mentioned earlier that we at one time expected the church to produce healthy, well-adjusted families. We're finding some very dysfunctional families in this period of the 1990s. And I believe with all of my heart that the only answer is to turn back to God's standards. I believe there is no other solution. Now, we have a lot of enemies with that. All you have to do is turn on TV or pick up a magazine that you can buy on any newsstand and realize just how far we have slipped, or maybe we have fallen into immorality as a society. Certainly materialism has played its role along these lines. But I believe that the greatest enemy we face as far as the church is concerned is that enemy from within, not those enemies from without. And that enemy is that we have come to conform to the world by misplaced priorities. In a sense, instead of marching to Zion, we've marched to the tune of the world. And the results are, even in the church, far too many broken marriages. Too many children who are delinquent or disturbed. And as a result of that, instead of us being the light of the world and the salt of the earth, we've lost a lot of our influence. We sometimes wonder why the church isn't growing, and then we look at our families, and we realize that perhaps those of the world do not see anything all that different from members of the church as a whole. Right. Many communities that exist really out in the world. Now, what is God's intent for the family? What does God really want? You know, the family was established back in the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 2. And the word family is used many times in the Old Testament. In fact, at least 200 times, maybe more in various forms. I think of the patriarchal age, and immediately when you hear that word patriarch, you think of a father, and thus of a family. It's the father rule age. And the family life and the religious life was centered around that patriarch, who may have been a father or grandfather for that matter. And those early patriarchs, beginning with Abraham, began to be concerned about the children, or maybe I shouldn't say the children, but the wife their children married, and especially that firstborn son. When the law of Moses was given, again, you see a lot of emphasis on the family. You see the responsibility fathers have. Deuteronomy chapter 6, that they're to teach, to train their children. And of course, the book of Proverbs is filled with the advice of a father to his son. And really a lot of good advice for all of the members of the family. Admonitions for young and old. And then I think of examples in the Old Testament of the family strengths and family weaknesses. I think of the beautiful story of Ruth and Naomi and that family togetherness. And then I think of what happens when partiality is shown in such stories as Rachel and Jacob, Jacob and Joseph. I think of what tragedy can come to great men within a family when they neglect their children, such as the children of Eli or Absalom, son of David. But when we come to the New Testament, the family is really, really keynoted. Deity was made flesh in a family setting. And I've made this point a number of times, and I think I'll continue to. If God had intended that children be born out and grow up in a single-parent family as the first choice, then surely Joseph and Mary would not have married before Jesus was born. Joseph found out that she was with child, and remember he was told by the Lord that it was all right to take Mary to be a wife. So you see, God's intent, even in sending his son to this earth, was that he grew up in a normal family situation. Remember that Jesus later had brothers and sisters. The New Testament books, the epistles, are filled with instructions for members of the family, for husband and wife, such as Ephesians 5:22 through 33, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 Peter chapter 3. And then Ephesians 6:1 through 4 speaks to parents and children as well. I think there are 4 good reasons we need to consider how God and the Bible relate. Number 1, it would be difficult really to understand our relationship to God if we did not have this analogy of the family. God as our Heavenly Father. Jesus Christ as our elder brother. Our relationship as brothers and sisters in Christ all relates back to the family. Number 2, Jesus showed concern for the family relationship. His first recorded miracle was at a family setting, a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. And then he often, it seems, visited in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in Bethany. It was like his home away from home when he was outside the region of Galilee and down in Judea. And then the people of the Bible are presented in interpersonal relationships within family settings. The stability of the church, number 4, is dependent upon the family. You really stop and think about it. When we talk about the future of the church, we're also talking about the need to strengthen the family. The church will never be any stronger than the families that make it up. What's happened to the family? And let's get into this. And again, I wish I had more time. I'd like for us to zero in on basically 4 things that have happened, and they're all interrelated. And I go back to that period before World War II, and then contrast that with that period after World War II. Back in the 1990 issue of Newsweek, the special issue, the winter-spring issue, the whole book was on the family, or I should say the whole magazine, that issue. But one issue in particular, or one article rather, in that issue that caught my attention was entitled, "What Happened to the Family?" And so I developed a lecture along those lines. There have been a lot of changes in the family. In the first place, before World War II, America was a predominantly rural society. Yes, we had our cities, but about 80% of all Americans either lived on the farm or in small towns, in rural settings. Of course, World War II changed that. It really began before the war. It actually had its beginnings with the Depression. You began to see more and more families as they settled into the city for economic reasons. So as time went on, by the 1950s, 70% of all Americans lived in urban settings, and by 1980, 80% lived in urban settings. So in a matter of about 20 to 25 years, we changed from a predominantly rural to predominantly urban society without really having the skills to cope with those changes. And what had happened in Europe in about 400 years, just with a natural change in the society, happened in our country very abruptly. That seems to be the pattern of America, for things to change rapidly. The second thing is that back in pre-World War II days, children were economic assets. They worked alongside their parents. And by the way, in connection with that, we can look down to number 4. That gave the parents the opportunity to be the primary role model. They were with their kids all day, usually out in the fields or out around the farm doing chores. And if the children didn't do what they needed to do or what was placed before them to do, there might be some consequences to face in terms of the next day, such as if they didn't gather the eggs and they didn't milk the cow, there might not be any breakfast. So they learned some very basic lessons as they grew up. Today, and when I present this, I always have to qualify and say we still love you, young people, but children are tremendous financial liabilities, especially when we have to send them on off to college. Not very many of them, unless they're movie stars or something, make much contribution to the family. But folks, that's really important because many young people do not feel that they're really doing anything constructively for the family. Young people who are a part of the whole economic picture of the family feel better about it. And that was the predominant situation in that period before World War II. Number three, the extended family. Most people before World War II grew up in small communities with other family members. In other words, they had these young couples as they married, they had their parents, in many cases a grandparent or maybe both grandparents. They had aunts and uncles and cousins to give them support. And when they taught their children as they came along certain moral and spiritual values, these other family members were there to back it up. They move into the city and they, in this what has been called the nuclear family, and we could go even beyond that to say it's become more and more the single parent family, they no longer have that extended family. And before we conclude tonight, we want to talk about how important that is. Parents were once the primary role model. Today, peers and others are. Take a quick look at this transparency taken from the Johnson Company. In 1960, no longer than that, parents were the primary role model of 13 to 19-year-olds. Today, it's friends. Friends were down in third place in 1960. So in a period, and really this is a 1980 instead of the 90s, in a period of about 20 years, look at the difference, the change that has taken place in our society. By the way, you who are preachers were ranked fourth in 1960, and now we're ranked down at number 6 as far as primary role models is concerned. But look down at the very bottom of this, in the 1980s, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and so forth are hardly there, and there's a reason for that. In the 1940s, 60 to 70% of all households were made up of a grandparent, either living there or very nearby. Did you know today only about 2% of all young people have the opportunity to be around their grandparent or their grandchildren, or the children to be around their grandparents? Now, 1975, a noted sociologist, Dr. Uri Bronfenbrenner, made 4 predictions. I wish he had been wrong. He says by 1980 and 90, in that period, there will be an increased isolation of the family. There will be a decline of the extended family. It won't have that impact. There will be an increase in the number of working mothers and thus an increase in daycare centers. You might say, well, what difference does all of that make? He says as a result of that, we're going to see a rising crime rate in the 80s and 90s. We're going to see more and more young people in serious trouble. And there's going to be a tremendous rise in the number of juvenile or teen suicides. I regret to say that his predictions have come true. What kind of qualities really make for the strong Christian family? I want us to get into this because I think it's so terribly important. Back a few years ago, Dr. Nick Stenay, who happens to be a member of the church, did a study first in Oklahoma. Studied 99 strong families across the state, using every county in the state, using the county extension agents. And what he was trying to do was to identify positive characteristics that would promote strong families. Later, he did this nationwide, surveying over 3,000 families. And the criteria was this: the family had to be in the first marriage, the husband and wife, in the first marriage. There had to be at least one child still home, still a minor. There had to be good family relationships. The marriage was considered by both husband and wife to be a strong marriage, and there was a good relationship between the child or children and their parents. And here's what he found out. These were the 6 common characteristics, both in that poll that was taken across Oklahoma, looking at these 99 strong families, and the 3,000 plus families across the United States. Let's look at them each. Number 1, they learned to express appreciation for one another. And there was a minimum of criticism. Minimum of put-downs. They respected one another. I find in many homes that are supposed to be Christian homes, there isn't the respect, really, for family members there ought to be. And when I read such passages as Ephesians 4:32, be ye kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, I think, where should we begin to do this? Where else but the home, with our own family members? 1 Corinthians 13:4, love suffers long and is kind. And I see some of the most unkind things going on within the family setting. So, in these strong families, these families where it was really working, where they felt good about one another, they expressed that appreciation and they held criticism to a minimum. Number 2, They love to do things together. They guarded their family time jealously. I'm really concerned that we have bought into this fast-paced lifestyle, and that's one of the prices that we're paying now in seeing the breakdown of our family units, even in the church. So many times, parents, because they say we must be about taking care of financial needs, we have to work, and we have all these other duties and responsibilities. We just don't have the time together we ought to have. And we'll have a little bit of quality time in bits and pieces. Folks, it doesn't work that way. You can't have quality time in bits and pieces. In 1975, it was found that fathers were using or actually spending no more than 7.2 minutes per day with their young children. By the 1980s, both parents were spending and actually communicating with their children only an average of 14.5 minutes a day. And most of that was in directing and correcting and instructing them rather than listening to them. That's a tragedy. Some of our children really want more than anything else for mommy and daddy to spend a little bit of time with them. Here's where if you're a grandparent and you're around those grandkids all the time, you can fill in. And the kids really, really need it. Number 3, good communication. Every one of these families, they learn to communicate. I like to put communication along these lines. You know, communication is, in some respects, to a marriage and to love in marriage like blood is to the body. When it stops, the body begins to die. And so it is when we quit communicating, love begins to die. And the marriage begins to fall apart. There are a lot of good passages, such as Proverbs 1:5, James 1:19, many others, that point to the fact that we need to listen rather than talk so much. Some of us do an awful lot of talking to our companion, for that matter, or to our children, but we really don't listen. I found as a counselor, and I'm not alone in sharing this, that at least 85% of all marital problems can be traced back to poor communication. One way or the other, the problem lies in the inability of the husband and wife to communicate. And problems between parents and children, or between siblings, very often goes back to the fact that they are not communicating as they should. Number 5, a high degree of commitment. You know, Genesis 2:24 makes it rather plain that God expects us to leave our parents, and cleave to our companion. And that leave doesn't just mean to distance ourselves geographically. There's an emotional leave. And there is a commitment that's made at the time of marriage. Probably the commitment ought to be made at the time of proposal and the acceptance of the proposal. That this is going to be the significant person in my life. We cannot cleave to a person unless we are first left parents. I think Jesus emphasized the idea of commitment in Matthew 19:6 when he says, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder." Commitment in marriage. These families had a high degree of commitment. Then there was a high degree of religious orientation. Even though many of these families in Oklahoma and across the nation were not members of the Lord's church, everyone had this one thing in common as these strong families were chosen for the survey. They all had a high degree of religious orientation. That meant, number 1, that they were regular worshipers. But more than that, that they were trying to put into practice the principles they learned from the Bible. I think it's sad that in a number of families where the families worship regularly, and where it seems as though it's a very religious home, there are so many interpersonal problems. And I can't help but feel that at least to some extent there has been the failure to put into practical day-to-day application the lessons that have been learned from the Word of God. And the Bible has a great deal to say about our responsibility to one another. Number 6, every one of these families were able to deal with crisis in a positive way. Now, you know, we're all going to face crisis. There's no way to get around it. And yet every one of these families managed, because of their faith in one another and to an extent a faith in God, to be drawn closer together when the crisis came. Families that are dysfunctional are going to fly apart when crisis comes. Families truly that are strong, as they should be, are going to be drawn closer together, and they'll really be a stronger family as a result of the crisis. And let's talk about some challenges to strengthen the family in the church as we have time. First of all, let's talk about parenting. We're losing too many of our children in the church. We talk about all the reasons the church isn't growing. We can talk about the doctrine not being distinctive, and I agree with that in a lot of places. That's exactly the truth. We can talk about the fact we've lost our zeal, but you get right down to it, one of the major reasons the church isn't growing is that we're having more and more of our young people grow up and remain unfaithful. Some of them are losing their concern for spiritual matters before they ever leave home. What are the desirable goals most people have for their children? I think all of us realize how important it is that they have a sense of self-worth, that they feel good about themselves. Number two, they respect authority. If they don't do that, the authority of God starting out, the authority of parents, the authority of teachers, the authority of law enforcement officers, they're going to have a hard time in life. Number three, I think we as Christian parents want our children to adopt the religious and moral values we have. Those are the desires. But you know, there are some powerful forces that influence children, but the two most powerful ones ought to come from parents. And in a sense they will, one way or the other. One of these is parental control and the other parental support. By parental control I mean the ability on the part of the parents to manage the behavior of the child. And by support I mean making the child feel truly loved. There are 4 styles of parenting that have been suggested by a lot of people in the field of counseling and child psychology. And I think it pretty well is representative of parents I see in the church. First of all, we have permissive parents. They have very little control over their children. They don't control the behavior of the child. The child may feel the parents really love them, though someday they may grow up and resent the fact they didn't discipline them. But nevertheless, there can be a lot of love there. But for whatever the reason is, they just don't have much control over it. The neglected parent, of course, or style of parenting is not really any parenting at all. They just let them grow up like wild weeds. So there's no control, and certainly there's no love felt as far as the children are concerned. And then there's the authoritarian style. And perhaps this is the style that some of us were influenced by, especially those of us who are a little bit older. And that was that we're the parents, we are going to rule with an iron fist. Well, I believe parents have authority, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the desire ought to be not simply to control the behavior of the child, but to make the child feel loved, feel like a significant person. And so the authoritarian parent may have control over the child at least to a certain age, but the child will not feel loved. I want to suggest that Ephesians 6, 1 through 4 presents the authoritative style of parenting. It's not permissive, and it's certainly not neglected. But notice what the apostle says there. You know, he addresses children first and says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." There's your control, obedience. And then he goes ahead to say, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath or to anger." There's the authoritarian style. "But bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord." When we bring our children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, they'll love us, and they'll know, even though they must obey, that we love them. I believe that Ephesians 6, 1 through 4 presents the proper style for parenting. Now, let's look at the rigid and the chaotic family. Again, not enough time here, but see if you can pick your family out. I don't need a show of hands here. If I had more time, I'd describe these 5 areas of leadership discipline. They pretty well explain themselves. But you see the rigid on the one hand, the very authoritarian type, where the discipline's so strict, where there's limited negotiation. I said it and that's it. You know, no back talk. I don't have to explain it to you. I'm the parent. The over-organized. Everything's all planned out. The kids could never make any suggestion. And the values become inflexible. Now, the contrast to that is the chaotic. No leadership, permissive, endless negotiation, disorganized organization, and shifting values. The Christian family surely needs to be somewhere around the structured and the flexible. Certainly the parents need to lead. There must be discipline, but it needs to be fair. Sometimes a little bit of negotiation works without compromising the Word of God or compromising the position of the parents. Children sometimes have good ideas we might listen to. And we need to realize, of course, that God's standards are the ones to always follow. Strong marriages will strengthen the family. I'm afraid that we bought into the idea that love is romance, and that marriages, even in the church, are being dissolved in the name of romance. If I had more time to develop this, I'd do it, but I'll just simply say that not only do we need romance in our marriages, we need a lot of agape. Because agape is both a decision and a commitment. Romance is an emotion that comes and goes. But when I have agape in my marriage, then I'm going to be determined to love my companion with agape, whether I feel very romantic at the moment or not. I'm going to treat them right. What are the three greatest foes to a strong marriage? Selfishness, pride, low self-esteem. Selfish person who wants his way or her way all the time. Inflexible. Pride, hardest words in the world to say are not "I love you," but "I'm sorry." Low self-esteem. When a person doesn't feel good about themselves, it's hard to have a strong marriage. Now, let's conclude this because we've got about something like 10 minutes, and I want enough time for some general discussion. And I'm not quite through, so don't think that you're quite away from it. I believe that there needs to be the need, or there is the need, for more prevention and early intervention as far as it comes to the family. I'd like to address, I don't know how many elders we have here. I know we have some preachers, and we have men who have served as elders, and I assume that there are probably some elders in this audience. But I would really encourage, as we think about the Lord's church in the 1990s, that we think in terms of the elders as shepherds really coming to know the flock. I'm not opposed to elders being interested in the budget. They have to. I believe in their authority. I'm not one who says that they lead only by example. I know they have to be concerned about the maintenance of the building, but a lot of times other people handle these things. But in many congregations, families are getting into trouble. And it isn't until the family unit has literally fallen apart or is going flying in every direction that the elders say, uh-oh, we're in trouble here. We need to do something. I believe, again, that elders as shepherds need to know the flock to the extent that they begin to see these things in the early stages and try to do something about it. There's a second thing that I strongly recommend. I believe that congregations need to be support systems for those who have lost their family in the sense of not being close to their extended family. And they need some other people to step in there and do something. We talked about how different our urban setting is today from the period of the 1930s and 40s when we were a predominantly rural society. And you really stop and think about it, the church can do this. It's appropriate that the local congregation be that extended family. If we're not brothers and sisters, I've misread my Bible. And I think there's another thing. I'm not sure we have encouraged our older women, or that our older women have taken as seriously as they should, Titus 2, 4 and 5. I've heard that applied simply to mothers teaching their daughters. Well, I agree with that, but I think it has a broader meaning than that. It doesn't say, let the older women, in quotes, mothers, but older women. Maybe if we want to put anything in quotes, it'd be mother figures. Teach the younger women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be keepers in the home, and so forth. I think that's a great untapped resource in most congregations. I'm going to take the time now to answer questions because I don't like to lecture this way, and the only way I could cover all this material was to do it just like I did in this time frame. And we have about, I think, if I read it right, 5 minutes. Are there any questions that I might answer on this general area? If not, I'll go again. Anything I may have said you didn't understand? Yes, sir.
I'd just like to know if some of these statistics and things you had on the chart, are they in the book? All those?
I'm not sure they are, and if you would like to have that information, I wish I'd have run off some extra copies. I would have been a little better prepared had it not been for the fact that I ended up having to fly, and I intended to drive down here, and so I was very limited on what I could bring at the last minute when I realized I was going to get not necessarily iced in, but I was going to have a hard time getting here. So I don't have it, but I can make that available. If you'll just let me know, give me your name, I'll be happy to send the copies of the transparencies.
Bill, we can even take those transparencies and copy them if you'd like.
Okay. Okay. That'll be fine, and you're welcome to do that. Okay. Let me show one other thing to you, and you may have some more questions. Here's what's happening in our country. Here's a comparison of crime statistics in a recent year. This is from FBI Crime Report 1989. The country of Norway and metropolitan Detroit are about the same in population. Just take a look. Murder, 72 in Norway. Detroit, 768. Rapes in Norway, 469. Detroit, 2760. Robbery, 700 to about 17,000 in Detroit. Norway, burglary, 6,000. Detroit, 65,000. And total violent crimes, 7,200 in Norway, 41,600 and something in Detroit. Here's the interesting thing about it. What's the difference? The Norwegian embassy official in Washington, D.C. was asked to comment on these figures. He says, here's why Norway's crime rate's so low. Number one, we are a stable country with a strong emphasis on traditional values, like family togetherness. And number two, we have few of the extremes of wealth and poverty found in other countries. Well, we can't do a lot about that in this country with our more of a free enterprise system. Number three, literacy is 100%, so everyone has the ability to get a good job. Also, a vast majority of Norway's citizens live by the honor code. They take great pride in being honest. Norwegians are justifiably proud of their low crime rate. You know, as I read that, the thing that was saddest to me is practically all of these Norwegians have never heard of New Testament Christianity. And yet they have moral standards that in some respects put us to shame. Well, does that mean we abandon New Testament Christianity? Absolutely not. It means that we need to be sure, again, in our Christian families, that we're practicing biblical principles day by day in our relationship to one another. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
This is more a comment than it is a question.
Go right ahead.
I think it helps to underscore the point that you made. A lot of times we would do well to learn from what we consider backward countries. Because I recently read that the country of Uganda, in order to stem the spread of the AIDS virus in their country, decided to buy 20,000 Bibles and distribute them to their young people so they would learn biblical morals and thereby stem the tide of the spread of AIDS. And I got to thinking, it's like I could have had a V8, why?
Yes.
That's the perfect solution.
Eddie needs to write an article. I could have had a V8. Go from there. Should do that. Okay. Any other questions? I think I do these seminars. The material I covered, I usually do in 3 hour-and-a-half sessions at least. And so a lot of this, I just had to really rush through it to get the overview. I would encourage you to buy the book. Dave doesn't mind you buying the book, and it has more material. If I had simply read it, I think it would have been boring. Anyone that's in here I know can read as well, or maybe better than I can. And I'm going to give you some additional information that might not be in the book.
You teach this